Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. How are you today? I hope you are doing great. It's a beautiful day to be alive. Well, I am Eva Risani, your host, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to another episode of The Language Maven. And it is brought to you by my company, Transcentral Pty Limited. Today, I have someone exceptional. Well, I always have exceptional people with me, but really, it's a language maven in the sense that she's working with language and she is driven by something beautiful. She said yes to tackling a very interesting theme with me today. We are going to discuss terminology, a massive part of stereotyping. This is very, very interesting. You want to be here, so you are at the right place. And my guest is a beautiful young woman. Yes, I know. I'm saying beautiful because I know she is. She is, you will see. And she is a researcher and project officer at the Disability Rights Unit at the Center for Human Rights at the Law Faculty, University of Pretoria. Let me tell you a little bit about her, and I need to read. I didn't learn by heart her bio. It's very good. So allow me to read. So Sabeeha is an LLB graduate and soon to be LLM graduate. She's awaiting graduation from the University of Pretoria. By the way, I also graduated at University of Pretoria. So, woohoo! She's doing a master's dissertation. She focused on access to inclusive, quality, basic education for children with disabilities in South Africa. How wonderful is that? In her role as researcher, she is responsible for various activities, tasks, and projects, such as the planning and execution of the annual Disability Rights in Africa conference, developing advocacy strategies around various themes relating to persons with disabilities in Africa, and so on and so forth. I could go on and on and on, but we have limited time. I want to use the time we have to really give you something good. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to the beautiful Sabeeha. Hello, Sabeeha.
Hi, hi Eva. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. It's a
Thank
pleasure to be
you.
here.
Thank you so much for saying
Thank
yes
you.
and for being with us today.
No,
You
I'm very
know,
happy to be here.
I can't believe that we actually are here. So let's say thank you to technology because
Oh, for
you are
sure.
somewhere, I'm somewhere, and
And you
yet
are
look at us.
somewhere.
Exactly. And, I just want to tell a small story. I like, sharing stories, and I would like people to understand how this came through. So basically, the university through you contacted me for a
Mm-hmm.
translation of a document that was dealing with persons with disabilities. And
Yes.
doing so, we started having a working relationship and we started discussing terminology. And then when I
Mm-hmm.
submitted the translation, I told you, wow, that was such an eye opener. Like sometimes I would find myself crying because of the way, people were referring to persons with disabilities. And I would actually feel bad translating some of the words that were in the report. And that's where the conversation started. And then I ask you, would you do me the honor to grace the show and talk about terminology, a massive part of stereotyping? And you said yes. And here we are now.
No, it's really my pleasure. I think it's so important that, using media as a tool to create awareness and just, for people to understand. Because I feel like sometimes when you're not personally impacted by something, you don't fully understand the gravity of it. That's why I'm very happy to be here today and hopefully try and, create some awareness at least.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Sabiha. And I agree with you because, sometimes
Mhm.
people don't really realize what's going on until they become aware of what is going on.
Yeah,
So let's hope that
yeah,
this is just the beginning of a conversation. But I know that a lot is being said about inclusive language, about maybe not,
yeah,
maybe they are not talking about terminology as such, but
yeah,
the power of words and how words can affect, create, uh, kill,
hmm,
or really reinforce stereotyping. So
yeah,
let's dig into what we are for today. And let's start with that question. So, what inspired you to get into your field?
yeah. Thank you for that, Ava. It's actually a very layered question and something very personal for me. So I always knew that I wanted to study law. My interest has always been in human rights law, particularly socioeconomic rights. So once I got accepted for my LLB at the University of Pretoria. I was very excited, because it is the number one law faculty on the African continent. So, I was very
Wow.
excited to be accepted into a very prestigious institution. And
Mhm.
yeah, once it started,
Congratulations.
thank you. And once it started the program, um, I noticed that there was actually so much of a focus on modules that are more commercial rather than, modules that focus on human rights and socioeconomic rights. And, that to me was just, it was sad actually, because it created this impression that everyone should just aim to be working at like a Santon law firm, and make it
Mhm.
seem as though that is the pinnacle of being a lawyer. And
Mhm.
that was something that I've personally never been passionate about. And I honestly believe that if you're not passionate about something, there's no point of doing it. And then
Agreed.
in my third year of my LLB, I was elected into the Faculty House Executive Committee, and I
Mm.
co-headed the outreach portfolio. So myself and a colleague of mine, Andrea, we co-headed the portfolios together. And that year we decided that our theme for the year would be inclusivity. So
Wow.
yeah, so we decided that we wanted to do an event for for the students with disabilities on campus, because very
Mm.
often, they're very excluded from the
Yes.
social events. It might not be accessible and, treated almost as if subhuman.
Mhm.
Yeah, so we organized this social event, where we also just created a platform for these students to, sort of speak out about their experiences. And they spoke about how difficult it actually is, or rather how difficult things are made for them. The
Mm.
lack of accommodations,
Mhm.
um, for example, with exam papers, maybe
Mm.
not having the correct accommodations put into place,
Mm.
the elevators not having braille for visually impaired learners.
Mhm.
So, and I also had a close friend. His name is Tabang, and he is visually impaired himself. And we
Mhm.
started our undergrad together.
Wow.
And yeah, so I noticed that at first, for the first 2 weeks, I think we had orientation week and then we had our first week of lectures. And he used to come with someone that would assist him around the place. And then after that, he was coming alone. So I think one day I even spoke to him and I asked him, so how do you actually manage to, navigate your way around campus?
Mm.
And so he explained to me like once somebody, is able to guide him around for the first few days, then after that he's able to navigate his way. So
Wow.
I began thinking to myself, like it shouldn't be difficult.
Mm.
There should be measures put into place to assist students with visual impairments.
Mm,
students with physical disabilities, whatever
mhm,
disability it might be.
mhm.
Um, yeah, so it's just something I think that is personal for me because of things that I've witnessed during my undergrad. And then once I started with my master's, I definitely knew that, my focus would be on education and disabilities. And then the reason I selected basic education was because I feel like that's where it all begins.
Yes, wow.
So once you have that solid foundation,
Mm,
because if you don't have access to basic education, you're not
mhm.
even going to make it to that phase of tertiary education. And there's actually a statistic that says, I think it's about 25%, not even, it might be even more, of learners with children with disabilities don't have any access to education
Oh
at
my
all
God, that's
in
a
South
lot.
Africa. Yes, it's
Wow,
it's a
this
lot.
is huge. Yes.
Yeah,
It's really huge. So it means that there's a problem because
yeah,
every child should be able to have access to education, irrespective of if they have disabilities
yeah,
or not.
yeah.
Wow. And do you know if those statistics are actually including um, like children living in rural areas, or is it also
Yeah.
with urban
Yes.
areas? Or
So that's the thing. And the statistics, even Stats SA themselves have cautioned that these statistics might not be entirely accurate. So as you would know, I think the last population census was done back, I think it might have been 2000 and over 10 years ago, yeah, over a decade ago. And then they
sure.
recently did a new census in 2022. And I think those results are just going to be published now or anytime
Okay.
now. But
Hmm.
even those statistics, I think you need to be approached with caution because
That's true. Mm.
those results were collected or the data was collected during COVID. You
Oh
know,
yeah, okay,
yeah,
yeah.
which
But
means
at least it gives us an idea, of
yeah,
what's going on, of the situation.
for
And,
sure,
it
for
tells us that
sure,
there's work to be done. And
yeah. And the
and
data
I
is not
understand.
very
Yes, it's
reliable.
not accurate. Yes, exactly.
It's not
So
reliable.
it makes what you do even more important because there
Yeah.
is a need. There's definitely a need.
No,
And
I
I'm glad
agree.
we are talking about that. So how are you
Mhm.
disrupting that trend? How are you tackling this? So by this I mean what we are talking about now. So the fact that terminology
Mhm.
is playing an important role in stereotyping or in reinforcing stereotyping.
Yeah. No, honestly, I think aside from the work that I do on a personal level, because I think that is so much more important, than the things you do under professional guises rather than personally as a human. I think it's really important that each of us as individuals, we start with tackling this in our own homes. So often you hear people using derogatory terminologies, for example, referring to someone as crippled or handicapped or,
Exactly.
yeah, or for
Hmm.
someone with albinism, as in
Hmm.
albino,
Exactly.
um, you
Albino,
know,
yes.
very
Hmm.
harmful, very
Hmm.
harmful words, very
Hmm.
derogatory, words that almost demote you to like a subhuman class.
Hmm.
And then also for like people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, the words like retard, imbecile,
Exactly.
insanity.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think, personally, it's, and for each individual, it's really important that, you tackle these things in your day to day life, in society. Obviously, it is important that these things are put into education system, into the curriculums, maybe into the policies and the legislation. But,
Hmm.
if it doesn't change within people, no amount of policy is ever going to bring about change. Obviously, it plays a big role because I know in many African countries, actually, they still refer to like people with intellectual disabilities as retards and imbeciles, like
Mhm.
in official policy and legislation. So I think that is, I think it's very sad, but it's also an indication of, where our governments are at, and
Mm.
actually how little they've done, or how little they're willing to do to
Mhm.
actually change the status quo. Yeah, so, but again, I think changing policies and changing the wording in the policies can only do so much, because,
Yes,
yeah,
I
it really
agree
just
with you.
starts with each and every one of us.
Mhm.
The only time that we can actually tackle this is if each and every person does their part, and actually calling out behaviors that you think are unacceptable. And I know people are afraid to have these conversations because they think that they're uncomfortable.
Mhm.
But honestly, they're conversations that need to be had, because we can't allow society to, continue allowing persons with disabilities to feel like subhuman, because,
I agree with you. No,
we're
and
all
it's,
equal.
what you say is so
Mm.
true, because I remember in Gabon, because I'm from
Yeah, yeah,
Gabon.
yeah.
So I live in
Oh,
South Africa, but
nice.
I'm from Gabon. And
Yeah,
I remember when I was younger, there was a person with albinism,
right.
who was studying in the same high school I was, and the
Yeah.
way the other kids were, treating him, and the
Mm-hmm.
way people were calling him, and I think it's the same word, albino. In French, you say albino, tu es un albino, you are,
In English as
and
well. Yeah.
you see, and the thing is, it was so normal that growing up, I thought that was the correct
Yes.
word to
No,
use,
likewise.
you know?
Likewise.
And it's actually working on your documents and documents from other international organizations or human rights associations
Yeah.
that I realized that it was derogative, that it was not the term to be
Not
used. It
acceptable.
was not acceptable. It's not inclusive. And then it made me
Mm-hmm.
realize that, whoa, as an individual, I didn't even, like think of
Yeah.
that as something important to, discuss or pay attention
Yeah.
to. So I just took it the way it was in society, and I thought that's how we call them,
Yeah.
until, my eyes were opened, and then I realized that, wow, so
Mm-hmm.
language can be so
Powerful.
powerful and so,
Mm.
negative. And
Mm-hmm.
language can reinforce stereotyping. Language can
Yeah.
really play an important role in deepening people into a state of, discriminated people, or it's even a type of segregation, kind of,
Yeah, it
and
really it impacts the way that people are treated in society. Because
definitely.
if you refer to one person as an albino and they're in a classroom, for example, then this
Mhm.
person is automatically singled out,
Exactly.
and made to
Yes.
feel like they don't belong. Um,
Yes,
and yeah,
that's true.
we've recently done a research report on the impact of race and color on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism in South Africa. Generally, you get a lot of this type of research coming out of East Africa, because there's a lot of attacks against persons with albinism, particularly
Yes.
in East
Mhm,
Africa. In
mhm,
Tanzania in particular.
mhm.
Yeah, so a lot of research has originated from there, and you will hear the most horrific stories.
I
Persons with
know, I
albinism
cried.
being, yes, persons with
Yes,
albinism being
killed,
murdered and their
and
body parts
in
being
a
used
horrifying way, because
in
I
a
read
horrifying
one time
way.
that the child was not even killed before they cut the parts. Like,
Yeah,
the child was still alive because of, their beliefs, that,
yeah,
they have a power or something, that they
a
can be used for muti and
harmful
things
belief.
like that.
Yeah,
Yes, and these are wrong beliefs, false beliefs, and when you were using the term that they are subhumans, I see
Did
it's
the
like they are
subhumans.
treated not even as subhumans, but like as animals. And I
Even
remember
worse
that
than an animal.
even worse. So then, and I'm glad we're talking about that because it takes us to the
Yeah,
next
me too.
question. Can we talk of language stereotyping? Because if so, knowing that there are different types of language stereotyping, which one could be associated with what we are dealing with right now? Because you've got different types of language stereotyping. You've got cultural, social, racial, gender, and religious language stereotyping. So, what do you think um, this belongs to?
Yeah, I think it's honestly it's a combination of things. So
Mm,
cultural, social, and religious that often go hand in hand. Um, because in certain religions, people believe or used to believe like being born with a disability is like a punishment from
it's
God.
a curse.
It's a
Yes,
curse
that's
from
true.
God. The
Yes.
mother was, for example, maybe the mother was not a faithful wife. She committed
Mm,
adultery, and that's the reason
mm,
why your child was born with a disability. So those are obviously rooted in very harmful, deeply rooted religious, cultural, and social issues. But again, I think to bring us back to the point in albinism, I think a lot of it is rooted in cultural beliefs.
mm,
That's why you would find that these attacks on persons with albinism are more prominent on the African continent.
mm,
Not to say that they don't happen outside of Africa, but they're obviously
mm,
more prominent within the African continent, particularly
mm.
East Africa, and then also certain Southern African countries like Malawi. Um, so, yeah, culture, it seems, African culture, certain African cultures, where it's believed that, albinism is a curse or persons born with
Mhm,
albinism are, they have special powers. So if
mm,
you have their body parts, you're gonna become rich, kind of
true.
thing. So
Mm,
I think these are just cultural, social, and religious. Like I said, I think it's intersectional.
mm,
It's never just one thing without the other. All of these
true.
things just build
Mm,
on each other. And
mm.
I also think, the fact that people grow up with these beliefs,
That's true.
you grow up
Exactly.
believing something,
Mm, mm,
and
mm,
then as an adult, if you're told, that's not what you're supposed to believe, this process of unlearning and relearning is very difficult.
it is. It
And,
is.
and
Mm,
yes, and then a lot of
mm,
people are just simply not willing, to unlearn things
mm,
or to try and challenge like the status quo or to like challenge elders in your
mm,
family. You don't want to be seen as someone who's like disrespectful or a rebel,
mm,
so you tend to just believe what you've been told, um,
mm.
yeah, by the
That's
elders.
true.
And yeah, very
Hmm.
often, the things that are being passed on, it's very harmful. It's not inclusive. It doesn't allow for society to grow in a way
That's
that is
true.
healthy, in a way
Mm,
that allows all humans to be actually treated as humans. Yeah.
hmm.
So to answer the
Yeah,
question, I really do think it's just a whole combination of things. I don't think we can pinpoint it to one single
just
factor,
one.
but
Or yes, I agree with you. And I think it's the same with persons with disabilities because there are different kinds of disabilities. And for example, if we talk about mental health, like
yeah,
some people don't understand that there are different types of mental issues. And
yeah,
most of the time, every time people will say something like, if they say they are sick or something, that they are not feeling well, or they have an odd behavior, they will be called
yeah.
crazy.
Crazy,
They will
insane,
insane,
retarded.
exactly, retarded and everything. And I think that, like as you said, this is all part of cultural, social, uh,
Sometimes religious as well.
sometimes religious, yes, language stereotyping. Because if we understand that, we are all humans, we are all coming from the same source, we are all um, you know uh, living in this world. As such, we should all have rights. And I think that irrespective of what you are going through, it is something you are going through. So I like the fact that you used the word accommodations earlier. And I don't know if people understand what it means in
What
this
it
context.
means.
And that's
Yeah.
also why I love languages so much, because depending on the
There's so
context,
much
the
to
word can
unpack.
mean exactly, because by accommodations here, we are talking about the means to make things more accessible, to make life,
Yeah,
better,
percent.
easier,
Yeah.
more
To add,
manageable.
yes, to add on to
Hmm.
accessibility, I think it's also
Yes.
important, like for people to understand that there's no one size fits all approach when it
Hmm.
comes to accommodation. So, for example, you might have two people with visual impairments, right? One might prefer to have their documents in Braille, whilst another would prefer to have their documents like in a PDF format, that they can use with a screen reader.
Hmm.
So there's no like a one size fits all approach to say, okay, all of you have an intellectual disability, like this is the accommodation that we will provide, or all of you have a physical disability, this is the accommodation.
Mm.
So yeah, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities actually speaks about individualized accommodations being made.
And I agree. I think it would
Yes,
make more sense because, like you said, you cannot use the same accommodations for someone,
because we're all
for
different
example.
people.
Exactly. And different types of disabilities. So,
Exactly.
but I think that the main problem is it is too difficult, to look at things that way, like change the perceptions, because I think it's a
Yeah,
matter of perceptions. How do you perceive things?
definitely.
Do you perceive things through a person with disabilities way of looking at the situation, or are you looking at it through your own perception and everything you've learned about what persons with disability are, or how they should be treated, or what they should be called, so it takes, and I like what you said earlier, that it starts with us
Yeah.
understanding that we have to unlearn. I
It's
even want to go
definitely a
further.
process.
It's a process, and I would say we have to work on unstereotyping things. So it means
Yeah.
that now we need to look at people for who they are people, and understand and try to put ourselves in their shoes.
To
How
understand
would you
them.
feel if you
Yeah.
were in their shoes? What would you do if people were treating you the way they are treating them? And if you understand that, then you will feel for the other person, and you will feel like, okay, how can I make life more accessible to you? But without patronizing, because there's also
Yes,
something
yes, yes.
that's also something we see. People will see you as a child,
100%.
kind of, because you have a
100%.
disability. And I
Yeah.
think that you, as a lawyer, know even more than I do that they are struggling with their right to access justice and
Justice,
and
education, healthcare,
education, exactly,
employment,
employment.
employment
And this
is
is
a big
because
one.
of the perception that society has about persons
Yeah.
with disabilities, or about persons with albinisms, or and so
Mm.
there's a lot to be done,
Yeah.
but it starts with each one of us, really.
Just a clarity on the
Hmm.
point that you previously made. So,
Yes, please.
albinism is actually regarded as a disability. So I'm not sure if like people are aware of that, but
That's very good.
I
Thank you
know that a
for
lot. Yeah, I know
raising
that
that.
a lot of people are not aware of that, but it's
Hmm.
officially recognized as a disability by the United Nations.
Wow.
Yeah, and
Wow.
by the African human rights systems as well.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think
But it
also to
makes sense.
understand. Yes,
Hmm.
yes. Also to understand a bit of background. Um, so there's been different approaches to disability, in international human rights law as well throughout the
Mm.
decades. So um, after World War II, there was a focus on the medical approach to disability. This meant
Yes.
that persons with disabilities were just viewed as like patients. They're just people who needed help. They needed rehabilitation.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and that was obviously very patronizing, as you said.
Yes.
To
Mhm,
be
mhm,
treated as someone who's just constantly in need of like assistance and being treated as a patient, throughout your life. And
mm.
then there was a shift to the social model of disability. So the social model essentially says that, um, so the issue is the fact that the society itself is not accessible.
Mhm,
So if society is made accessible, then persons with disabilities will be able to access it. So the
mhm.
focus is not on the
On the
disability that
person
a
and the
person
disability,
has.
yes,
The
but rather
focus
on the
is
society.
on the
Mm.
society.
Mhm,
So that approach is still valid together with the human rights model, which is the newest
mhm,
model. So the human
mhm,
rights model essentially keeps what the social model says, but then also treats disability rights as human rights. So it's a human rights issue. Like
it
the lack of
is.
accessibility is a human rights issue. Yeah.
Mhm,
So I think despite this change, I think a lot of people still view disability from the medical approach lens.
mhm.
You would still find a lot of people today still viewing persons with disabilities as patients, and people just needing rehabilitation, like you need assistance. Yeah, but again, it's a process.
It
So we
is, it
start
is,
let's start where we can.
it
I
is.
think even personally, I'm still learning every day. I learn through working with the people that I work with,
Mhm,
working with persons with
mhm.
disabilities themselves. I think that's been like the greatest part of my learning. I've actually had a few colleagues that have had disabilities themselves. So a colleague of mine was visually impaired. I learned a lot from him about just understanding, what it
Mhm,
means to have accommodations. I think that's where I finally understood like there's no one size fits all approach. So even though two people might have the same disability, what works for one
mm.
person might not necessarily, work for another. And then
Mm.
also understanding, intersectionality. So sometimes people are discriminated against because of disability, but then at the same time, for being a woman, for being
That's
black,
true. Mhm.
for
And I'm glad you talk about that.
living in a township. So
Yes.
there's a lot of different layers.
Mhm. It's true.
Mm.
But yeah, we don't have time to unpack all of that. But
Oh no.
indeed, indeed. And it's interesting to see that language is used as a tool to reinforce, that
Hundred
stereotyping. And
percent.
being careful
Hundred
of how we
percent.
use words will go far, will go a long way. So,
Hundred
and
percent.
talking about that, I have another question for you. Do you think that media can play a role in unstereotyping? Because we've seen, like for example, now I'm not talking about disabilities, but for example, in the case of gender violence, I'm sure
Yeah.
you've also read or listened, watched the news, and the way the information is carried,
Yeah.
it makes it gives the impression that the woman is the object,
Somewhat
is like
responsible.
exactly like she was found dead or like she was raped. It's like we are using a passive voice to
Yeah.
explain a situation but without really putting the finger where it hurts the most. And I think that media has an important role to play in unstereotyping. And it's not just
Mhm.
in terms of gender violence, it is also in terms of For example, we were talking about persons with disabilities. And I think the media can also educate people about, for example, people living with albinism, like instead of talking and repeating what is being said and the false beliefs, maybe we can instead talk about the truth and say what
Yeah.
things are, you see? Because by repeating false beliefs, we are also, in a way, like
Perpetuating.
perpetuating it. Exactly. So, what do you think?
No, definitely. And I think, there's a role to play for every sector. So media is definitely one of them, but then also education. I think that's a major one. I think I
Mm,
even mentioned earlier that I think there needs to be some level of like human rights and disability rights education, at maybe
mhm.
a primary school level, or even, sign language being taught at schools.
True.
I mean, it's a huge step that was recently, um, formally accepted as an official
Yes, as a
language in South
12th, I think
Africa.
it's the 12th South
Top
African language,
official,
yes, which
yes,
is
yeah. So
wonderful.
I think that
Mm,
was a huge step.
mm,
But now again, it comes down to implementation. So I think education has a huge role to play. Healthcare has a huge role to play.
true.
In maybe training nurses, training doctors,
Mm,
because I've heard a lot of stories about persons with disabilities being born and like nurses are not adequately trained, and then they treating the child like, this child is an alien, like
oh,
there's something
yeah.
extremely wrong with this child. So I think
Mm-hmm.
healthcare also has an important role to play, and definitely
Mm,
media. I think we live in a digital age, and
mm,
we observe so much from the
mm-hmm.
media, social
Mm-hmm.
media, television, radio, whatever it may be. We really absorb what we hear. And, media has a powerful role to play because what the media says literally gets ingrained
Mm-hmm.
into our minds. So the way the media says things, the way they frame things, the terminologies that they use. So
Mm,
if you have a media house using a derogatory term, you would automatically think, it's acceptable. You
yes.
wouldn't tend to question what media says.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely, media has definitely been used for a lot of incorrect purposes throughout the
Mm,
years. But I think moving forward, it's something that media needs to work on. And I think your live show is actually a good example of that. You're from part of the media, so it's
thank you.
no, it's really good to see that there are
Mm,
people out there,
mm,
within media, within journalism, languages,
mhm,
whatever it may be, that are
mhm.
willing to raise awareness and willing to make that change.
Thank you. You really warmed my heart just now.
No, you're
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you so much, Sabiha. And, it's crazy, but we've come to the end of the show. And it's a
The
pity
time
because,
has fly.
yes, but I think that we really raised important issues
No,
and we really
definitely.
answered important questions. We really discussed the theme. And this is just the beginning. It's a conversation that we are
Definitely.
starting. And I invite people
Mm,
to join the conversation, to post their
definitely.
comments, to really let's do something together because the
Yeah,
more we are raising this awareness, the more maybe things will change. So
yeah.
thank you very much for the work you are doing. Thank you for saying yes to
No, thank
coming
you
to
for
the show.
having me. I really enjoyed this, and honestly, it's something I'd be willing and open to do again.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'll call you again.
So
You said it. So I
I
will
said
call
it,
you
and you
again.
have proof. You have proof.
Yeah, proof. You heard her,
Uh,
people. You heard her. So there will be. there will be another time, because this is, I can see that this is a theme that's very interesting, that's very
There's a lot to
important.
unpack.
There's a lot to unpack, and we will unpack more. So thank you once again, Sabeeha. People, if you want to contact Sabeeha, you can send her an email. You can see sabeeha.majid@up.ac.za, and she's a very lovely person. You see, I didn't
Thank
lie when I
you.
said that she
Thank
was
you.
beautiful. She's beautiful in and out, isn't it?
Thank you,
And
Eva.
you've inspired us. I'm really inspired, and I feel like I've grown, since I've met you, since I've done that translation for you, and I keep on growing, because now it's like it's like when you do a you do your drivers, then suddenly you know what those signs mean. It's the same
Yeah,
with this, it's the
it's a
same, and now
process, and
it's
we're
a
all
process.
learning. We're all learning
Exactly,
all the
we
time.
are, we
Yeah,
are definitely.
that's
So
that's
thank
that's a good
you.
thing about learning. It never stops.
It never stops. Yes, and
It never
when
stops.
you stop, then you stop growing. So it's
Exactly.
something very important.
I
And
agree.
remember that you people do business. We handle your language needs. So contact director at transcentral.co.za for all your translation, interpretation, language training services. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please share this. Let us raise more awareness about this. It is very important. It starts with you, and let's be the change we want to see. Thank you once again, Sabiha.
Thank
Congratulations
you,
on everything
Eva.
you've done, and keep it up.
You too. Thank
And
you.
see you very soon.
I look forward to speaking to you again.
Bye bye,
Bye.
everyone.